Please be seated. As Elgar's tribute to the mighty hunter Nimrod fades, I'd like to welcome you to St. Mary's Church and to thank you for your presence here today as we remember and celebrate the life of Dr. Richard Cook. We welcome Richard too, with us one last time at the heart of this community in which he lived and which he served so well as a doctor. And we surround him and Jenny and the family with our love. Our service today consists of tributes that will remind us of Richard's gifts of personality, mind, and character, and of his life and work. We will laugh and cry as we share memories, celebrate his life, and mark his passing with deep respect and gratitude. Our opening tribute comes from the Shropshire Lad and is read by Jenny.
I've chosen this poem to remind me of happy days. When we were newly married, we lived in a flat in London opposite the British Museum, which Nick will remember, and maybe a few other people who are here. And in the kitchen, one of us would climb up on top of the fridge, sit there with our legs swinging, and declaim out of the Shropshire Lad, while the other one got on with something a bit more useful, like cooking the supper. Secondly, we've had lots of lovely walks in the Shropshire Hills with people who are here. And thirdly, I really like the sentiment of this poem that whatever troubles we're going through, whether it's a rubbish disease like Parkinson's, or whether it's the loss of somebody, in the grand scheme of things, those troubles don't last terribly long, and we will get through them. So this is poem number 51 from a Shropshire Lad. Loitering with a vacant eye along the Grecian gallery and brooding on my heavy ill, I met a statue standing still. Still in marble stone stood he, and steadfastly he looked at me. Well met, I thought the look would say. We both were fashioned far away. We neither knew when we were young these Londoners we live among. Still he stood and eyed me hard, an earnest and a grave regard. What, lad? Drooping with your lot, I too would be where I am not. I too survey that endless line of men whose thoughts are not as mine. Years ere you stood up from rest, on my neck the collar pressed. Years when you lay down your ill, I shall stand and bear it still. Courage, lad, 'tis not for long. Stand, quit you like stone, be strong. So I thought his look would say, and light on me my trouble lay. And I stepped out in flesh and bone, manful like the man of stone.
We come to celebrate and appreciate the life of someone we all know so well, Dr. Richard John Cook. There are many things that were important to Richard, his friends, the community, patients, but above all, I feel sure he would say his family came first and foremost. He was husband to Jenny, father to Amy, Jim, and Ed, grandfather to Tom, Clara, and Elise, Ben, Ella, and Louisa, and of course, not forgetting his in-laws. It was these relationships which were absolutely central in Richard's life. Richard was born to John and Beryl Cook on the 18th of September 1947 at 84 Badminton Road, Balham, South London. His sister Angela was 3 years older, and I was not even thought about, coming into the world 7 years later. Richard's father, indeed our father, John Cook, was at the time making that difficult transition to Civvy Street from the Navy, having served a significant and grueling part of the Second World War as a surgeon lieutenant in the Arctic convoys. It was a time of petrol coupons, rationing, and at home finances were stretched. Our mother made all the children's clothes, her own and even our father's white work shirts. To be prudent and careful with money and hard-working were considered virtues, which Richard took on board and adhered to throughout his life. In 1950, the family moved to Horsforth near Leeds. Our father had secured a job at Leeds General Infirmary as a registrar. Richard's relationship with school was not the best. In fact, it could be said he hated all his schooling. He attended Featherbank Infant School at the age of 5 and had to be coaxed to go each day. It was not unknown for Richard to be carried by the caretaker, shouting and struggling across the threshold into school, something I hope would not happen today. In 1955, at the age of 8, Richard passed his entrance exam to Silcote School, a public boarding school near Wakefield, attending as a weekly boarder. I was to join him 7 years later. Sunday afternoons at home were full of gloom, and every Monday was like the beginning of term. The weekly return was so traumatic, it was eventually decided to send him to board full-time. The logic of this escapes me. Father took up a position as a consultant neurologist at Pinderfields Hospital in Wakefield the same year, specializing in head and spinal injuries. The family moved to a newly commissioned house in New Miller Dam in 1956, which sat in almost an acre of garden. From a builder's site and former estate orchard, it took years of hard work to fashion it into what became a beautiful garden. All the family became involved, which I largely escaped, being only 2 years old. Much of Richard's character was formed in these early years. Our father John was ambitious, not only for himself and his own career, but for his children also. Most of Father's ambitions were focused on Richard, a spotlight which proved to be a mixed blessing. As well as tending vegetables, Richard and his father would process film and develop photographs in the darkroom, make crystal radios, build a canvas canoe, constructed lengths of brick wall and arches along the boundary of the garden. Some of those exist even today. John Cook, our father, has observed the easy self-confidence of public schoolboys in the Navy and at medical school, who were so different from him, a grammar school product. He was determined that especially his boys should have chances he didn't have, hence we too were sent to boarding school. His main aim was to nurture and the development of character in us and to provide opportunities of enriching our personal life experiences. Having been brought up with boys' own heroes and been a scout himself, he engendered similar aspirations in his children. Richard was bought the Eagle, full of exploration and endeavour. It was a post-war age of heroic exploits, with Edmund Hillary making the first ascent of Everest in 1953, when Richard was at the impressionable age of 6. So Father and Richard took up canoeing, rock climbing, and mountaineering in the days before harnesses, just ropes tied round the waist. They headed out for Stanage Edge in the Peak District. Richard and Father spent time at Ogwen in Snowdonia in the company of Don Willans, Mo Antoine, and Joe Brown, amongst others. Climbers later become known for their ascents of the southwest face of Everest and climbing Annapurna, amongst other daring feats. Later, all three of us would head out for the Lake District, or Glencoe, with a small tent, always pitching at altitude, far away from creature comforts and civilization. Many other activities took Father and Richard's interest, building bunk beds and cupboards out of timber, long before the advent of IKEA, making sledges and wooden toys for me. These were all useful experiences for Richard, developing skills and passions he put to great use later in the properties he renovated with Jenny and the creative projects he embraced. I never knew a time when it wasn't taken for granted that Richard would study medicine. Being bright, it was realized he was a potential Oxbridge candidate. Duly applied and was accepted for St. John's College, Oxford. Characteristically, our father felt he would benefit from a bit more worldly experience first. The organisation Voluntary Service Overseas, VSO, at the time sponsored young people to undertake voluntary work around the world. Richard was accepted with much excitement and was one of 3 youngsters sponsored by the Daily Mail. He was provided with a camera and was required to write 3 articles during the year for the newspaper. He took up the position with a British medical team in Laos, a former French colony in Southeast Asia. The year was 1965 to 66, and Richard spent his time going off into the jungle treating lepers with the most horrible wounds. The small team would travel in sampans along the River Mekong and navigate its tributaries to places they couldn't reach with their Land Rovers. What was not widely known at the time, or acknowledged by the Americans, was that the Vietnam War had spread into Cambodia and Laos. In fact, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, used by the Viet Cong, passed right through Laos. Richard was in the thick of it. At boarding school at breakfast, the post would be handed out. Other boys opened neatly written letters from home and postcards, whilst I would receive strange packages with diplomatic bag stickers all over it, invariably smelling a little suspect. Inside, a hastily scribbled letter would accompany photographs taken by Richard of American troop briefings in the jungle, of planes that had been shot down, of Chinese shells when there was a total denial by the Chinese they were arming the Viet Cong. Sometimes there would be a small, slightly whiffy dead lizard, some Lao banknotes, once a large black scorpion, and photographs of people, pretty Lao nurses who he was allegedly teaching English. Richard returned home with his eyes opened, his horizons expanded, and having an aversion for American neocolonialism. This was an enriching personal experience for a young man just 18 years old, the recollections of which lasted his lifetime. In the fall of 1966, Richard went to Oxford. In that year, the most significant event of Richard's adult life occurred. It was fortuitous in the collegiate system that the students were allocated places in the laboratories according to name. Richard's second name was Cook, having similarities with that of a certain tall, attractive fellow female student by the name of Coombs. That student, of course, was Jenny. Therefore, they sat next to each other in the labs during physiology. They soon came to an arrangement. Richard had certain anatomical advantages over Jenny when it came to providing urine samples, while Jenny supplied the blood because Richard was terrible with injections, as he continued to be throughout his life. Jenny found Richard bright, funny, and with a deadpan sense of humour, so much so people didn't know when he was joking. The attraction was mutual, each kindling the blossoming relationship, which, as we know, lasted the remainder of their life together. On the 21st of March 1970, Richard and Jenny were married in the registry office, followed by a service in the St. John's College Chapel. After a one-night honeymoon away, incidentally having lunch in Ross, they returned to Oxford to take their pathology and bacteriology viva exams on the Monday. In October 1970, Richard and Jenny started St. Bartholomew's Hospital Medical School in London. After the liberal encouragement to develop ideas in Oxford, they both found Bart stiflingly rigid and a bit of a disappointment. In December 1974, there was much excitement with the birth of Amy, Richard and Jenny's first child. They bought their first house, Popcorn, in Walthamstow for £3,250, and living off Richard's grant, money was very tight. They virtually gutted the house, doing all the work themselves, spending every available bit of spare time on the property. Moving on through qualifying as a doctor and completing house jobs, in September 1975, they left London for Richard to undertake 6 months as a GP trainee in Brecon, where Jenny recollects they made lots of friends. They then moved to Hereford for their paediatrics, obstetrics and gynecology jobs before the move to Ross in August 1977, joining the Chepstow House Surgery, living in a small house in Alton Street. Life was hectic, and the small peripatetic family seemed to settle at last. Rich and Jenny had to develop a different mindset as the realization dawned that now Ross-on-Wye would be where they would settle, make their permanent home, and Richard would probably spend the rest of his life until his retirement as a local GP. Their second child, Jim, was born in September 1977, followed by Ed in 1980. The little family was now complete, and a new chapter started with moving to Galen Lodge in February 1981, where they lived for 19 years until their final move to 1 Sussex Avenue, experiencing the excitement and problems of building their own eco-house. Richard finally died in his own home on Friday the 9th of September from Parkinson's disease. He had Jenny and Jim by his side, ably and warmly supported by visiting nurses and carers, a number of whom had been patients of Richard's and whom he had helped as their GP at times of need. So who was Richard? In many ways, Richard was a paradox. He was a conformist, always wearing a tie to work because that was what he felt was expected of him, and correct, yet he so often broke with convention. He had a strong set of values or principles which could be uncomfortable for others, and at times even created difficulties for himself. Richard was a thoroughly decent man. He liked and admired innovators, especially people who broke conventions, who thought differently and had intellect. Salvador Dali, William Morris, Peter the Great spring to mind, and at the top of the list is Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And yet, he personally felt constrained by rules. He was both conformist and strongly anti-establishment, even to the point of being mildly anarchic. Richard was not showy and really quite private. He disliked exhibitionism and pomposity and wore his distinctly well-fitting hair shirt with a degree of pride. He admired soundness in people, those he considered good eggs, and yet he loved eccentricity and the bizarre, having an affinity for the truly absurd. Dressing up at Christmas became a family tradition, not as a recognized character, but wearing random clothes from the dressing up box. The more ridiculous the apparel, the better. Family and friends will remember his laughter, at times becoming uncontrollable, with tears running down his reddening face. Although Richard would deny and feel uncomfortable with the epithet artist, being far too pretentious, he was inventive and had an artistic streak. He enjoyed the abstract, and his own creations were controlled and imaginative, whether lamps out of copper pipe with tissue petals, petal lampshades, or the graphic creations with triangles of subtly differing textures and colours. Richard was fascinated by people, all sorts of people, but particularly those he admired, no matter what walk of life they came from. To be a friend was indeed a privilege. He collected them from all over the world, for the many countries he visited, too many to list here. But those among us today know who you are. He enjoyed companionship, possibly slightly different from friendship, of those he met casually or joined on their numerous jaunts and long walking holidays in Corsica, the Pyrenees, and twice on the Tour de Mont Blanc. He loved the countryside. He was, as Amy put it, present for his children. He was committed and devoted time to them. They grew up to be independent, resourceful individuals. What greater accolade for successful parenting can there be than that? Richard enjoyed and was good with children, especially his grandchildren, who he loved. He would not spoil or shower with gifts, but he would give of himself. But the person he gave his all to was Jenny. Jenny was his constant love, his companion to whom he was devoted, which we all could see and know. Richard influenced so many people, including me, through his generous help, assistance, guidance, wisdom, intelligence, and even example. So many benefited from knowing him. To end, I would like to quote from a letter from a Polish couple Richard befriended, Anna and Jacko Mikula, received shortly before Richard's death, which pretty much says it all. Dear Jenny, thank you very much for your email. We are terribly sorry to hear that Richard is in such a bad condition. Words cannot express how sad we are at this situation. It must be really hard for you and your family, as we are not able to talk to him. We will be very grateful if you can hold Richard's hand and pass on to him what we unfortunately cannot tell him in person. Dear Richard, the day we met changed our lives. You weren't just our English teacher. Thanks to you, we were able to develop. We got a good job. It was you who translated the questions and answers for job interview. You showed us a different point of view of the world. You showed us the National Trust. You told stories of England. You took us on for walks. You gave us your precious time. You were always honest. You accepted us and trusted despite the barriers. You did not judge us. You and Jenny were with us on one of the most important days of our life, at our wedding. For us, you both have become part of our family, our best friends. I wish you can see Reuben. He is jolly, always smiling lad. Even though you are not a big fan of football, you came to watch me playing at Weston. It meant a lot to me. We kept all our homeworks and stories dictated by you. We cannot wait for the children to grow up a little and we could read them interesting and funny stories. Our dearest friend, thank you for all you have done for us and our family. We owe so much to you. We cannot thank you enough for all the beautiful memories we made together. Please remember, this is not goodbye. It is just till we meet again. One day we will. With love, Anno Jacob. Now, while I collect myself, I'm going to introduce the next number. Now we're going to recapture those heady days for Richard and Jenny at Oxford. This is an enduring classic, forever associated with the period, an anthem to the 1967 Summer of Love. It will be sung by Kelstone, who had a close friendship with Richard, and were accompanied by Adrian Taylor on the organ. The words are in the service sheet in front of you. Please feel free to sing along. Whiter Shade of Pale.
I have a feeling that Cal's not here. Oh, Cal is here. That's why I was wondering what's going on. Cal, brilliant. Do you need a microphone? Right. Microphone is there. You can tell it's well rehearsed. There we go.
I didn't understand the signs, Adrian.
We'll work on it.
Please join me to sing this beautiful number. We skip the light fandango, turn cartwheels across the floor. I was feeling kinda seasick. The crowd called out for more. The room was humming harder as the ceiling flew away. When we called out for another drink, the waiter brought a tray, and so it was that later, as the miller told his tale, that a face at first just ghostly turned whiter, shade of pale. She said there is no reason, and the truth is plain to see. But I wandered through my playing cards, would not let her be one of 16 Vestal virgins who were leaving for the coast. And although my eyes eyes were open, they might just as well have been closed. And so it was that later, as the miller told his tale, that her face at first just ghostly turned a whiter shade of pale.
So how do you follow that? Thank you, Kel. Richard, dear Richard, I do hope somehow that you were able to witness this event. All these people who have come to celebrate your life and pay their respects. And in St. Mary's Church, of all places, the wonderful St. Mary's Church, under whose spire you have lived and worked for so many years. Chepstow House Surgery was just a few doors away. Whilst thinking about what to say today, tributes were pouring in for Queen Elizabeth II. And it was uncanny how many of them were so relevant and identical to some of your attributes. Devotion to her people, wisdom, dignified, sense of humour, public duty, lifelong service, sacrifice, curiosity, loyalty. Maybe not a passionate lover of horses and horse racing and corgis, but replace horse racing with Gloucester rugby and corgis for wildlife in general, and the similarities endure. I know this gives Jenny comfort, and it has been suggested by one or two other people, but I'd like you to all imagine that Richard has been hand-picked to be the late Queen's personal GP. And whilst not being the most ardent of monarchists, I am 100% certain that he would carry out this role with his usual dedication and full commitment, and maybe just a wry little smile. Just imagine them, both sitting there with a cup of tea, putting the world to rights. Wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall to listen to the debate? So as you heard, Richard and Jenny moved to Ross in 1977, and in those days this was a huge decision, as there was an expectation that this was a move for life. It's where you would live, you'd work, bring up your family, retire, and eventually pass. And this is exactly what happened. Richard joined what was then Chepstow House Surgery, where he worked as a GP for well over 30 years, eventually becoming the senior partner. But Richard was not any old GP. He was a local GP. Some might term it as an old-fashioned GP, living on the patch, working on the patch, and contributing so much, so fully to the local community in so many ways. I believe Richard was at his happiest professionally in the first part of his career, when, with one or two others, he provided 24-hour care for the practice population. This was true general practice for him, providing care from birth to death, building trusting relationships, being there night and day. This involved being on call every second or third night and every second or third weekend. And whilst this will undoubtedly have been to the detriment of his family life at times, he truly felt this was providing holistic care for his patients. In the early years, this involved 6-minute consultations. And I think his record was doing 13 home visits on one day, suturing up people's noses after rugby injuries late on a Tuesday night, visiting a new mother at a weekend to help with breastfeeding difficulties. On this occasion, the simple advice was drink a pint of water and everything would be fine. And indeed it was. Often just being there or being available was all the reassurance that was needed. Most of the neighbourhood knew when Richard was on call. In the early days, the phones were redirected to our homes out of working hours, and to be able to spend time in the garden at weekends, he had an external bell fitted, which rang for miles around every time the surgery phone was called. Richard was impressively intelligent and well-read, which was certainly reflected in how he practiced medicine, but he was not an intellectual snob. In so many ways, general practice suited him well, allowing him to develop special interest in so many areas. He felt passionately about some of the more public health aspects of his work, trying to improve health and more importantly, prevent illness, so passionately that on occasions he could come across as being a bit blunt in his approach. And whilst this was not always appreciated at the time, I'm certain that this would have had a huge impact on some of his patients, helping them to lose weight or give up smoking, take a healthier diet or increase their exercise. One of the district nurses visiting Richard in his final days remembered the rollicking Richard had given her about smoking, so chose to visit a patient who was a heavy smoker after Richard, so that she would not arrive in Richard's house reeking of cigarette smoke. Indeed, one of the strong recollections Jenny has of Richard's last few weeks was how many of his carers had a personal story to tell of how Richard had looked after them or a close relative. The impact this had clearly had on them and their families, and in some small way they were now grateful to be able to repay some of his care and kindness. There was a paper recently that came out about a practice in Scotland that started prescribing exercise for their patients and how this was being rolled out to other practices across the district. Richard was well ahead of the game, as he was in so many other things, having done this exact thing over 25 years ago. He encouraged patients to get out and walk, joined walking groups, even led some walks for both patients and practice staff. He put up an ordnance survey map on the waiting room wall with marked walks of different grades and length, with accompanying leaflets giving walk descriptions. He was well ahead of his time in many other ways that he practiced medicine, only prescribing antibiotics rarely and only when absolutely necessary, robustly encouraging lifestyle changes before offering medication or any other intervention. Many of these values have become mainstream now, but certainly Richard was an early adopter, just as he was in other areas, such as building a super energy-efficient house and driving fuel-efficient cars. These values that he had in the wider holistic life were further demonstrated when we appointed Dr. Simon Linane to the partnership some years ago. When Simon was asked what his proudest achievement was, he immediately became the front runner in Richard's eyes when he said that it was growing vegetables in his allotment. In so many ways, Richard was never a bystander, as much in his professional life as well as his personal life. He became heavily involved in the management of primary care in the locality and more regionally in important roles in the PCT as it was then, roles for which there were never many volunteers, but through a sense of duty he took them on with commitment and enthusiasm. He was passionate about the benefits of community hospitals and the importance of caring for patients in the communities that they lived. Once again, he didn't just stand by, but he got fully involved, becoming a member of the National Community Hospitals Association. And by demonstrating effectiveness and high-quality care, they were able to lobby for their existence, preventing many hospitals from closing down. Locally, he was a committed supporter of the Friends of Ross Community Hospital, and on most Christmas days, he was to be found visiting the local hospital with his family, supporting patients and staff, and often carving the Christmas turkey. Richard made a huge impact on my life. Both Richard and Clive Hartson were hugely supportive mentors and impressive role models, being very influential in my professional life, for which I'm very grateful. Richard had this knack of somehow getting people involved in the various projects and activities he was part of. He took an interest in meeting and talking to others, and if anyone showed specific skill, they were quickly recruited. Dare any patient to let on that they played a brass instrument, and they were to be found playing for the Monmouth Big Band within weeks. He asked me one day if I'd ever be interested in hosting Oxford medical students for their 2-week attachment when they lived with us and shadowed us as a GP. This was the role that Richard and Jenny did for many years, gaining some long-lasting friendships. When out of politeness I showed an interest, I was surprised to receive an email the following day from the Dean welcoming me as a postgraduate tutor, before I'd even had a chance to talk it through with my wife, Sharon. Another time he asked if I'd be interested in joining the French Twinning Association. Once again, out of politeness, I showed an interest, only to be called a few days later by the chairman of the association, telling me that we'd been allocated a family who'd be coming to stay the following month. That was Richard's way. And for both of these things, I'm very grateful, as they also became big, integral parts of my life. So thank you, Richard. Richard and Jenny were founding members of the Jumelage, the French Twinning Association, which ended up being an important part of their lives. Their association initially was with a man called Monsieur Bernard Choyer and his family. Bernard could be described as a down-to-earth factory worker who admitted to being quite intimidated by being twinned with a local GP and staying with a family who he felt to be way above his status. His fears were quickly resolved, seeing Richard arrive to welcome them with Amy on his shoulders and being fully prepared to try out his French. This resulted in a long-lasting close friendship, which has continued over the many years with subsequent members of his family. Pascal Alizade, who is a former French mayor for Condé and now sitting as a senator in the French Parliament, recently sent me this message. He says, "I knew Richard from our twinning years and found him straightforward, very cultured, and always open and friendly. He was a humanist, as I liked them, friendship and respect to his family." And if I could plagiarize the French president, Richard was a true friend of France. Continuing in the theme of showing polite interest, Sharon and I soon found ourselves with Richard and Jenny in the Larapur Centre on a Sunday evening learning jazz jive dancing. I would challenge you to find two men who had less dancing ability than Richard and I. But as he did with most things, he put his heart into it, he tried hard, and more importantly, we enjoyed ourselves thoroughly. Walking was a big part of Richard's life, as you've heard. The first walk he took us on was when we visited soon after being appointed as partner with our 3-week-old son. When a walk was suggested, thinking this might be a gentle stroll along the railway track, we quickly agreed. There was 6 inches of snow on the ground, and 5 miles later, after walking along the Coppet Hill Ridge, we quickly realised that agreeing to go on a walk with the Cooks, what a walk with the Cooks actually involved. Another of the several memorable walks I did with Richard was at a time when he was having a particularly difficult time in the surgery. And whilst we were struggling to find potential solutions, he suggested going for a walk together the next weekend. We walked up Pen y Fan and certainly found we were able to think more rationally and develop a much more sound strategy for dealing with the problem. And this was certainly a case of practicing how he preached. Richard and Jenny loved their long-distance walks, including the West Highland Way on several occasions, various GR routes in France and Corsica, several trips through the Pyrenees. He loved meeting new people, taking an interest in what they had to say and what they did. He loved practicing his French and sharing jokes and anecdotes. On one occasion, when they were staying in one of the mountain refuges, they shared a dormitory with another French couple. And when they met up again a few days later, as you often do on these long-distance walks, the conversation moved to the difficult question of when you start using that French pronouns tu rather than vous, the more formal term. The other couple quickly replied that it was appropriate to use tu in their case, as they had already slept together. In the same room, of course. Richard was one of the fittest men I knew for his age on his retirement. For someone so health-conscious, it seemed so cruel that he was struck down with Parkinson's disease so soon after his retirement. But then Parkinson's disease is a cruel disease, and he had a particularly cruel variety of this illness. But in his usual style, whilst intensely frustrated by it, he weathered it with bravery and fortitude, determined to get on with life as best as he could. So Amy, Jim, and Ed, you don't need me to tell you this, as I'm sure you know already, but your father was incredibly proud of you all. Your independence, your banter, the way you sometimes did things a bit differently to the conventional ways. His eyes would light up when he talked to me about you and all your families. Whilst there must have been times when you resented the amount of time that was taken up with his work, I believe you can be justifiably proud and very proud of him and the things that he achieved for his patients in the wider community. Jenny, your loss will be a multitude of times more than anybody else's just now. You were so much to him, his soulmate, his best friend, and his lifelong partner. You certainly brought the best out of him. The two of you had such togetherness, such similar interests and passions. You made a great team. The void left will never be filled, but somehow I'm confident that you're well prepared to embark on the next phase of your life. And I hope that you feel supported in this. Richard, we salute you for your intellect, your good humour, your honesty, your conversation, your enthusiasm and commitment. Richard, you've been a huge influence on my life, both personally and professionally. Richard, you have had a huge influence on many others, both within and outside of this community. Richard, you've had a huge influence on the many patients you treated over so many years. And I'd like to finish with a passage about the meaning of success, which I feel is particularly relevant to Richard. And this is entitled, "What is Success?" So what is success? To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate the beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition. To know that even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. So one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. And Richard, you certainly succeeded. Thank you.
From bristly foliage you fell, complete, polished wood, gleaming mahogany, as perfect as a violin newly born of the treetops, that falling offered its sealed-in gifts, the hidden sweetness that grew in secret amid birds and leaves, a model of form, kin to wood and flower, an oval instrument that holds within it intact delight, an edible rose. In the heights you abandoned the sea urchin burr that parted its spines in the light of the chestnut tree. Through that slit you glimpsed the world, birds bursting with syllables, starry dew below, the heads of boys and girls, grasses stirring restlessly, smoke rising, rising. You made your decision, chestnut, and leaped to earth, burnished and ready, firm and smooth as the small breasts of the islands of America. You fell, you struck the ground, but nothing happened. The grass still stirred. The old chestnut sighed with the mouths of the forest of trees. A red leaf of autumn fell. Resolutely, the hours marched on across the earth. Because you are only a seed, chestnut tree, autumn, earth, water, heights, silence prepared the germ, the flowery density. The maternal eyelids that buried will again open toward the heights, the simple majesty of foliage, the dark, damp plan of new roots, the ancient but new dimensions of another chestnut tree in the earth.
When I am laid flying low over the warm roof of an old barn, down in a flask to the water, up and way with a cry, and a wild swoop and a swift turn and a fever of life under a thundery sky. So they go by. And high and high and high in the diamond light, they soar and they shriek in the sunlight when heaven is bare, with the pride of life in their strong flight, and a rapture of love to lift them, to hurtle them there, high and high in the diamond air. And away with the summer, away like the spirit of glee, flashing and calling, and strong on the wing, and wild in their play, with a high cry to the high sea, and a heart for the south, a heart for the diamond day. So they go over, so go away.
Thank you for everyone for coming today. I'd like to introduce the next piece of music, which is the last part of today's celebration. Following that, you are all invited to come and join us at the Royal Hotel for some refreshments. Everyone is invited. The first piece of music played at the start of the celebration was Nimrod by Elgar. Mum didn't choose that beautiful piece because it tops the Google search for music played at funerals, but because she and Dad chose it 52 years ago to be played at their wedding. The inappropriate choice of wedding music seems to have had little impact on their marriage, which has been very special. Full of love and dedication, it was a huge part of both their lives. The final piece of music today will be the wedding march to celebrate that wonderful marriage.